The morning started with a beep. A sharp electronic beep, followed by a voice that sounded like it had never learned softness. Miss Callahan, as per our policy, we do not reschedule interviews. Failure to appear at your assigned time will result in disqualification. Thank you. Click. Silence. Grace Callahan, 33, lay on a narrow cot, pushed against the peeling wall of a city shelter, one arm still hooked to a half-empty IV drip. Her face, pale from fever, turned toward the window, where the gray light of Detroit's winter barely made it past the grime-slicked glass. Her other arm trembled as she lowered the phone to her chest. Her body felt like it was trying to burn itself clean from the inside. She didn't even flinch when the IV tape tugged at her skin. In her worn canvas tote on the floor lay the folder she had spent 2 weeks preparing. Resume, references, printed cover letter. It wasn't impressive by corporate standards, but it was honest. Tucked between the pages was a tiny post-it note with her daughter's handwriting. It read, "You can do this, Mommy." Grace didn't cry. Crying took energy. She only stared up at the flickering ceiling light until her vision blurred. Then she closed her eyes and whispered, "She deserves better than this." At the corner of the room, a little girl sat cross-legged on a folded towel. Her name was Sadie. She was 7 years old, with hazel eyes far too steady for her age, and a mop of brown curls her mother could no longer afford to keep trimmed. Sadie had not interrupted the call. She knew the sound of rejection. It had a pattern. When Grace finally drifted into a shallow sleep, Sadie stood. She picked up the canvas tote, careful not to jostle the IV, and gently zipped it shut. She hesitated, glanced at her mother's clammy forehead, then walked to the small sink in the corner. She splashed her face, straightened her faded hoodie, pulled on the only pair of jeans without holes in the knees. And then, with the calm of a child who had watched too much fall apart to be surprised anymore, Sadie left the shelter. She remembered the building from the flyer on the fridge back in their last apartment before the eviction. Harborlight Ventures. Her mother called it the One Shot. It looked taller than Sadie remembered. All glass and angles. Not the kind of place that expected a kid with scuffed sneakers and a folder that smelled like hospital sanitizer. She stepped inside anyway. The woman at the front desk glanced up, saw her, and froze. "Sweetheart, are you lost?" "No," Sadie replied. "I'm here for my mom's interview." The woman blinked. "Your mom?" "She's sick. I brought her papers." The receptionist gave her a look that flickered between sympathy and confusion. She didn't know what box this moment fit into. "What's her name, honey?" "Grace Callahan." The woman tapped her keyboard. There it was. Interview scheduled for 9:30, the last slot of the morning. No reschedules. Sadie clutched the folder tighter. She had taken 2 buses and walked 3 blocks in the wind. She wasn't going back without being heard. The receptionist touched her earpiece. "Mr. Langston, I think you need to come down here." Miles Langston was not in the mood for interruptions. At 41, he had built Harborlight Ventures out of the ashes of a bankruptcy he'd inherited from his father. Everything he had, Noah's glass office, his manicured silence was the result of refusing to let anything slide. He didn't do sentiment. He barely tolerated empathy. He worked in numbers and data and brutal merit. So when the receptionist's voice came through his earpiece, "You need to see this in person," he almost said no. But something in her tone made him pause. When the elevator doors opened, Miles didn't expect what he saw. A little girl, standing calmly in the center of the lobby, holding a slightly bent folder like it was a shield. "Sadie, right?" he asked. She nodded. "You're Mr. Langston?" "Yes." She stepped forward. "My mom's supposed to be here, but she's sick. I know she wanted this a lot, so I came instead." Miles slowly took the folder from her hands. His thumb brushed the corner of the resume. A pink sticky note clung to the cover letter. "You can do this, Mommy." He swallowed once, eyes flicking over the child's face. "Come with me." He didn't know why he led her upstairs. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was the echo of something he didn't remember needing until this child reminded him. He sat across from her at the long table in the conference room. She swung her legs gently, not out of nervousness, out of rhythm. "So Sadie," he said, tone clipped but not unkind, "why should I hire your mom?" Sadie thought for a second. "Because she doesn't quit, even when she should." Miles raised an eyebrow. "That's unusual praise. She doesn't eat if I haven't eaten. She reads to me even when she's tired. She cleaned other people's toilets last year so I could get new shoes for school. She's done hard things." "She is a hard thing," Sadie said seriously, "but she's still soft, and that's harder." Miles stared at her, unsure whether he wanted to laugh or look away. "And why did you come here?" "Because she didn't get up this morning, and I've seen her push through worse, so I knew it had to be bad. And if she can fight that much for me, I can take one bus and 2 blocks for her." The room went still. He had heard thousands of interviews, but this delivered by a 7-year-old in a borrowed hoodie was the first one that made him feel like he was the one being measured. The call came just after noon. Grace blinked awake in her cot, mouth dry, chest aching from the fever. The IV bag was gone. The nurse had stopped checking hours ago. She reached for her phone out of habit, not hope. One missed call. Unknown number. Voicemail. She played it. "Miss Callahan, this is Joy at Harbor Light Ventures. I believe your daughter, Sadie, came by this morning with your interview materials. Our CEO would like to formally reschedule your interview at your earliest convenience. We hope you're feeling better soon." Grace sat up too fast. Her vision swam. She called back immediately. "I'm so sorry," she stammered when Joy answered. "I didn't know she left. She's 7. She must have—" "Miss Callahan," Joy said gently, "it's all right. She wasn't in any danger. In fact, she left a stronger impression than most adults ever manage." Grace didn't know whether to laugh or cry. Instead, she clutched the phone to her ear and whispered, "Thank you." The next morning, Grace stood outside Harbor Light Ventures. She wore her oldest black slacks, neatly pressed, and a borrowed blouse 1 size too big. She had brushed her hair, covered the fever bruises under her eyes with foundation she hadn't touched in months. Sadie had stayed at the shelter with a volunteer. Grace didn't know how she would thank her daughter or discipline her for what she'd done. But she had a meeting to survive first. Inside, Joy smiled like she had been waiting. "Mr. Langston is expecting you." The elevator ride was too quiet. When the doors opened, Grace stepped into an office wrapped in windows, all city and silence. And there he was, Miles Langston, more reserved than she imagined, but somehow more human too. He stood from behind his desk, not a trace of impatience in his face. "Miss Callahan," he said, "I'm glad you're here." "I'm still not sure I should be," she replied honestly. "Your daughter disagrees." He gestured to the chair. "Let's start over." She had practiced how to explain the 4-year gap in her work history. She didn't need to. He didn't ask. Instead, Miles asked, "What was the last project you truly cared about?" Grace blinked. "At my university, or since then?" "Either." She thought for a long moment. "I worked with a nonprofit that tracked food waste in local grocery chains. We created a platform that mapped where excess food could be redistributed daily." "Did it launch?" "No. We lost funding the month I found out I was pregnant." Miles only nodded. He didn't scribble notes. He didn't correct her diction. He just listened. Then she said quietly, "But I kept the wireframes. I still sketch updates sometimes, on paper bags." That made him smile. Later, he didn't tell her she was hired. He simply said, "You'll start as a data coordinator, part-time to begin, full benefits, we'll reassess in 3 months." She swallowed hard. "I'm not a charity case." "No," he said. "You're a missed opportunity I'd rather not miss again." Part 8. The elevator between them. At first, Grace didn't know how to belong. She arrived early, sat through onboarding, took notes like she hadn't been allowed in a room like that in years because she hadn't. The others were polite, distant. She was the one the boss hired himself. They didn't say it aloud, but she felt it in the pause after her name was mentioned, the sideways glances at her thrift store flats. But she stayed. She didn't try to impress. She simply tried not to mess up. And slowly, something shifted. A colleague asked her to explain a spreadsheet formula. Another left a coffee by her desk with a note, "Saw you skipped lunch." Even the floor manager, a woman named Lydia who hadn't smiled once the first week, stopped by one morning to say, "Your projections from last Friday were sharp." Grace just nodded. But inside, something long buried sat up and stretched. Miles kept his distance, mostly, but some things were hard to ignore, like the quiet way he always made sure she sat at the table during review meetings, or how he stopped the intern from talking over her in a weekly sync, or how, once, when Sadie came in early from school and sat in the break room, he dropped off a paper bag with 2 muffins and a note, "CEO-approved snack." Grace had smiled the entire train ride home. It was just after 6 on a Wednesday evening. Most of the office had emptied. Desks were dark, keyboards silent. The floor hummed with that specific kind of quiet that only existed when people had gone home, but something unspoken still lingered. Grace sat alone in the data room, lit by the blue glow of dual monitors. Her fingers hovered above the keyboard, but her mind was elsewhere. She hadn't eaten. Again, there was a granola bar in her drawer, but it felt like too much effort. When the door opened behind her, she didn't turn. She assumed it was security or someone grabbing a file. Then she heard his voice. "You always work through dinner." She exhaled softly. "Only on the days I need to feel useful." Miles walked in slowly. He didn't carry a laptop. No agenda, no folder. Just his hands in his pockets and a weariness on his face that Grace hadn't seen before. "You're already useful," he said. She gave a small smile. "Thanks, but I need to feel it." He leaned against the door frame. "How long have you been doing it alone?" She didn't ask what he meant. She just answered. 8 years. Since I was 25. You raised Sadie without help?" Grace looked down at her hands, dry and pale from the winter. "Her father left before the first ultrasound. My parents said I embarrassed them, that I made a mess out of my life." There was no bitterness in her voice, only the calm of someone who had accepted the weight long ago. Miles nodded. He seemed to understand that silence was the only fitting response. After a moment, she tilted her head. "What about you? You always carry that much pressure in your shoulders?" He gave the smallest laugh. "You notice that?" "I notice things." Miles looked at her, really looked. "My parents died when I was 16. I was a foster kid, moved 3 times in 2 years. I learned early that the only thing I could rely on was control." Grace held his gaze. "And has it helped?" He shrugged. "It built this. But some nights, I forget why I wanted it in the first place." That quiet hung between them, filled not with pity, but with recognition. 2 people who had lost early, who had rebuilt in the dark, who had kept showing up without being asked to. He stepped closer, not too close. "I don't usually talk about that. I don't usually get listened to," she said. They both smiled soft, real, tired. Not everything that begins quietly stays quiet. Friday afternoons became routine. Sadie would come straight from school to Harborlight Ventures, plop her backpack beside Grace's desk, and make herself at home. It started with just waiting, drawing, eating leftover bagels. But then Sadie started appearing in Miles's office, first by accident, then with purpose. She brought him origami stars, asked about the skyscraper plans on his wall, gave him unsolicited opinions about the color of his office rug. He let her. More than Faith welcomed her. One afternoon, Grace peeked in to find the 2 of them arguing softly over whether pineapple belonged on pizza. Sadie was winning. Miles looked like he didn't mind losing. "She called you Sir Serious Face last week," Grace said, folding her arms. "I've been called worse. She likes you." Miles paused. "And you?" She didn't answer, just smiled. But her eyes were gentler than before. It was a cold March evening when it happened. They were the last three people on the office floor: Grace, Sadie, and Miles. The city lights glittered outside. Somewhere in the distance, a snowplow rumbled through tired streets. Sadie was curled up on the couch in Miles's office, a juice box in one hand, a storybook in the other. Grace stood by the window, coat folded over her arm. "She's falling asleep," Miles said. "I can carry her down." Grace turned to pack up when Sadie spoke softly from the couch. "Can I call him something else?" They both looked at her. Sadie blinked up, her voice drowsy but clear. "Can I call him Dad?" Grace's heart stilled. Miles stopped moving entirely. No one said anything for a long time. Then Sadie added, "He brings me snacks and remembers my drawings. He talks to you like you matter, and he makes the scary days feel small." Grace knelt down, took her daughter's hand. "You can call him whatever feels true to you." Sadie smiled, then closed her eyes. Grace looked up at Miles. And for the first time, he didn't look away. Spring arrived slowly, with days that pretended warmth but left cold shadows behind buildings. Inside Harborlight Ventures, Grace moved with a steadiness she hadn't known she possessed. She still wasn't loud. She didn't bring muffins to meetings, or memorize birthdays, or charm people over drinks. But she showed up early, prepared, focused. And over time, they noticed. She caught mistakes in quarterly projections, organized workflows no one else wanted to touch, rebuilt a broken client dashboard in half a weekend without fanfare. One by one, the walls around her softened. The floor manager, Lydia, started copying her formatting style. A senior associate asked for her take before submitting a pitch. When people said her name now, they said it with intention, with respect. And through it all, Sadie remained part of the building's quiet rhythm, leaving sticky notes on cubicles, bringing drawings to the finance team, curling up with a blanket in the break room on snow days. Once, during a chaotic Monday, she announced to the whole floor, "Grace Callahan is my mom, and also the smartest person here." No one disagreed. The night before the company's spring banquet, Grace stood in front of her closet, staring at a single navy dress. It had no designer label, no shimmer, but it was clean, pressed, chosen. She hadn't worn it in years. Sadie came up beside her, eyes wide. "You look like a grown-up." Grace laughed softly. "I am one." "Yeah, but you look like one that matters." That made Grace pause. Later, in the cab, Sadie asked from the back seat, "Do you think he'll dance?" Grace didn't ask who she meant. She simply said, "I don't know." But she smiled. The banquet was held in the top-floor lounge of Harborlight's midtown building, glass walls, string lights, candles flickering along windowsills. Grace moved through the room with quiet confidence. She didn't cling to corners this time. She didn't apologize for standing alone. She belonged there. Sadie, in a pale yellow dress, stuck close at first, then wandered off to charm the HR director with a speech about unicorns and spreadsheets. Miles arrived late. Not because he meant to, because he needed to make sure he could walk into the room and not show everything he was feeling at once. He found Grace near the back, sipping sparkling cider, watching the room the way people who had once been on the outside always do, with awe and a little disbelief. When he reached her, she turned, smiled softly. "You clean up all right," she said. He nodded at her dress. "So do you." There was a hush as someone tapped a microphone. "Before we end the night," the MC said, "our CEO has something to say." Miles looked at Grace, then walked slowly to the front. He didn't carry notes. He didn't clear his throat. He simply began. "1 year ago, someone walked into this building who didn't belong. She wasn't on the hiring list. She didn't wear a suit. She was about 3 feet tall and carried a resume twice her size." The room chuckled. Miles went on. "She wasn't scheduled. She wasn't expected. But she changed something." He looked toward Sadie, who beamed from her table. "And then, not long after, her mother joined us. She didn't have a glowing LinkedIn profile or a corporate past, but she had clarity, precision, strength." He glanced at Grace. And she reminded me why I built this place in the first place. Not for numbers, not for power, but for people who never stop showing up, even when no one asks them to. He paused, then added, "Tonight, I don't want to celebrate growth projections or partnerships. I want to celebrate presence, resilience, the quiet courage it takes to start over." Then he stepped down and walked back toward Grace without looking at anyone else. They stood side by side on the rooftop after the banquet, just beyond the music and the wine glasses. The air was still. The city lights blinked like patient stars. "I didn't expect you to say all that," Grace said. "I didn't either," Miles replied. She turned toward him. "Do you regret it?" He shook his head. "I regret not saying it sooner." Sadie appeared between them, dragging a paper crown she'd stolen from the dessert table. "Can we go home?" Miles crouched down. "Your place or mine?" Sadie looked at Grace. Grace's eyes didn't move from his. "Ours," she said softly. "Ours," Sadie echoed. Miles smiled. And for the first time in years, he felt what he had once believed was lost forever. Not power, not success. Home. Months later, people would still talk about the little girl who came to an interview in a hoodie and rewrote the rules. But they'd talk more about Grace. About how she rose without pushing anyone down. About how she mentored interns who reminded her of herself. About how she became head of strategy in under 2 years. And on the 5th floor of Harbor Light Ventures, near the corner window, one light stayed on longer than the rest. It wasn't because someone was overworked. It was because someone had finally found a place worth staying for. Inside, Grace would be reviewing one last deck while Sadie colored next to her, and Miles would step in quietly, carrying 3 paper cups of hot cocoa. He would set them down. No grand speeches, no declarations. Just a nod, a quiet look. A life that began, as all real lives do, with a door left open and someone brave enough to walk through it.